Cernunnos. Even if you've never heard that name before, I can guarantee you recognize the Celtic deity to whom it belongs. Thanks in large part to his absorption into modern neo-pagan religious practices, Cernunnos, whose name means the Horned One, has become a mascot of sorts for Celtic mythology. But to clarify, and this is an important clarification, Cernunnos is not an Irish god. He's Gaulish, or Gallo-Roman, by which I mean Cernunnos was originally worshipped in ancient Gaul by Celtic-speaking peoples as early as the 5th century BCE, if not earlier, and that worship continued well after the Roman conquest of Gaul in the 1st century BCE. Indeed, depictions of Cernunnos from the Roman era often find him grouped together with Greco-Roman deities, most notably on the Pillar of the Boatmen, where he appears alongside, or rather on top of, Jupiter, Vulcan, Mars, and Mercury, amongst other figures. The pillar, which was erected during the 1st century CE in what is now Paris, France, also happens to provide the only undisputed instance of the name Cernunnos from ancient times. Thus, it has been used as a key of sorts for identifying other possible depictions of the horned god, including this one from Reims, France, this one from the Romano-British settlement of Corinium, modern-day Cirencester, and perhaps most famously, this one from the Guddenstrup cauldron, which was discovered in Denmark. Now, at this point, I could go into excruciating detail about the differences between Celtic mythology and Irish mythology, but I already did that in an earlier video, and you better believe I used the depiction of Cernunnos from the Guddenstrup cauldron to represent the Celtic side of the equation, or non-equation as it were. Because the one thing you really need to understand for the purposes of this video is that Gaulish deities and Irish deities belong to two distinct pantheons. True, both fall under the Celtic umbrella, as both pantheons originated with Celtic-speaking peoples, the Gauls and the Gaels respectively. And also true, there appear to be some cognates or similar deities within these pantheons, hinting at a shared, albeit distant, origin, which makes sense given the shared linguistic origin, Proto-Celtic. But at the end of the day, they're different. And despite what you may have read on Reddit, we'll get into it, there is no Irish version of Cernunnos. The Irish pantheon simply does not have a horned god. Or does it? That's what we're going to investigate. But first, for all you Celtic mythology superfans out there, might I humbly recommend the short story collection Neon Druid, an anthology of urban Celtic fantasy, and in particular the story Cave Canem by Ed Ahern, which offers a modern take on a certain horned someone. I've put the link in the description below if you want to check it out. Now, on with the show. There's an odd little passage floating around Reddit and Facebook and other corners of the internet that claims there are, quote, old Irish stories that describe Cernunnos under the name of Uindos and as the son of the High King of Ireland named Lugh, end quote. A few things to unpack here. First and foremost, there is no Irish god or character of any kind bearing the name Uindos in any of the medieval Irish texts in which the Irish myths were first recorded. So there's that. Second, and admittedly this one's more of a quibble, but referring to Lugh as a High King of Ireland is a bit reductionist. Yes, in the myths he is king for a time, but Lugh is also a god, the god of many talents. What's more, he's the savior of the good Irish gods, if you will, the Tuatha Dé Danann, leading them into battle against his grandfather, Balor of the Evil Eye, and the monstrous Fomorians. Speaking of Lugh's family tree, he does have a son, two actually, but neither are named Uindos. Instead, Lugh's sons are Ibic of the horses and the famed Irish hero Cumhaill. The closest thing I could find to an authoritative source for the Uindos Cernunnos theory is the book The Truth About Druids, in which author Teague MacCrossan defines Uindos as, quote, an ancient Celtic god, son of Nodens, in a group of great epic tales and romances called the Fenian cycle. Uindos is also called Cernunnos in Greek. Most famous incarnation is as Fionn MacCool, end quote. So in this version of the theory, Uindos has a different dad, the British Celtic god Nodens, who is likely cognate with the Irish god Nuada. But this inconsistency in parentage doesn't bother me so much as the assertion that Cernunnos is the Greek name of this hypothetical deity Uindos, when we know with a high degree of certainty that Cernunnos is a Latinization of the Gaulish Cernunnos, which in turn is derived from the root word carnon, meaning horn or antler. Attempting to connect Cernunnos to the Irish hero Fionn MacCool does make at least some sense, as Fionn, as described in the myths, is an accomplished hunter. This has led some scholars to identify Fionn as a so-called leader of the Wild Hunt, the Wild Hunt being a folklore motif that occurs across European cultures. Cernunnos, meanwhile, given that he is often depicted alongside stags and ram-headed serpents, is sometimes identified as the Lord of Wild Things, or the Lord of the Animals. But while it's easy to conflate the two, the leader of the Wild Hunt and the Lord of the Wild Things represent two different and in some ways opposite motifs. The former sees a mythical figure leading a hunting party in a violent chase, while the latter depicts a mythical figure in a Zen-like pose, taming or protecting wild animals. What these motifs most definitely have in common is that they were both applied retroactively to the figures in question. And ultimately, I think that's the best explanation for where this unattested Uindos figure comes from. It's a modern, neo-pagan creation that attempts to reconcile or combine these two mythical forces. That being said, Fionn McCool and his warrior band, the Fianna, are in the myths associated with a horn, the famed Dord Fionn, the hunting horde of the Fianna, which, depending on the context, can be used either to gather Irish warriors to the battlefield or to rouse Fionn from his eternal slumber. So while the Irish Fionn doesn't have horns on his head like the Gaulish Cernunnos, an argument can be made that he is nonetheless a horned hero. Staying within the Fenian cycle of Irish mythology, there is another character who is arguably a much better fit for the role of Cernunnos' counterpart, Derg Corra, son of Dagda. This relatively obscure character appears in just one relatively obscure story, Fionn and the Man in the Tree, a story that kicks off with your classic Celtic love triangle. The hero Fionn McCool desires a beautiful maiden, but the beautiful maiden desires one of Fionn's servants, Derg Corra. Not wanting to upset Fionn, Derg refuses the maiden's advances. But then the maiden gets upset and implores Fionn to kill him. So Derg goes into exile in the woods, and after the agreed upon 3-day truce, Fionn comes after him. Here's what happens next. Quote, "One day, as Fionn was in the wood, seeking him, he saw a man in the top of a tree, a black bird on his right shoulder, and in his left hand a white vessel of bronze filled with water, in which was a skittish trout, and a stag at the foot of the tree. And this was the practice of the man, cracking nuts, and he would give half the kernel of a nut to the black bird that was on his right shoulder, while he would himself eat the other half. And he would take an apple out of the bronze vessel that was in his left hand, divide it in two, throw one half to the stag that was at the foot of the tree, and then eat the other half himself. And on it he would drink a sip of water in the bronze vessel that was in his hand, so that he and the trout and the stag and the blackbird drank together." End quote. Now that imagery definitely gives off Cernunnos vibes, especially when you consider the Gaulish god is sometimes depicted with a cornucopia, or horn of plenty. So while our man in the tree, Derg Corra, doesn't have horns on his head, he does have that bronze vessel, which provides sustenance not only for himself, but for his furry, feathered, and scale-covered friends as well. Then there's his name. Derg can be translated as red, and Cor as point or peak. Again, not quite a horn, but the word is perhaps suggestive of one. Granted, Cor can also mean heron or crane, so there's really nothing conclusive here. And while the Lord of the Wild Things motif vibes certainly seem strong, there are other explanations for this man in the tree imagery. For example, there's the Wild Man of the Woods motif, which has been applied to characters including the Irish Sweeney Gilt, Mad Sweeney, the Scottish Lailochen, the Welsh Myrddinwilt, and later, Merlin of Arthurian legend fame. FYI, you can learn more about Celtic wild men over on irishmyths.com. There's also Celtic scholar William Sayers' theory that Derg Corra effectively creates or becomes a world tree, quote, "complete with various insignia of the tripartite cosmos as conceived in early Irish thought," end quote. Moving backward chronologically to an earlier cycle of Irish mythology, the Ulster cycle, we find another contender for the Irish Cernunnos crown, Conall Cernach, the famed Red Branch warrior and foster brother of Cumhaill. And right off the bat, hurling stick, we have a possible etymological connection to Cernunnos, because while Cernach is often interpreted as of the victories or triumphant, the presence of the root cairn has led some scholars to believe there is something horny about his name. Wait, that's not what However, considering that Conall is never described as having horns in the myths, it's possible that Cernach is a reference to the hero's tough, horn-like skin. There's also the following explanation, courtesy of the scholar J.A. McCulloch. Quote, The name Cernunnos signifies the horned one, from Cernu, horn, a word found in Conall's epithet Cernach. But this was not given him because he was horned, but because of the angular shape of his head, the angle, Cern, being the result of a blow. End quote. Epithet aside, there's a specific passage in the Tan Bo Freyc, Cattle Raid of Freyc, that hints at a possible Conall-Cernunnos connection. The passage finds Conall in the Alps assisting the titular Freyc in the rescue of his wife, 3 sons, and cattle. Alas, they come across a dune or fort in which Freyc's family is being held. Guarding that fort, a vicious serpent. An epic showdown seems imminent. The snake darts forward and proceeds to wrap itself around Conall's waist. Conall wears the snake like a belt as he and Freyc take the fort. When the rescue and requisite plundering are complete, Conall removes his snake belt and lets the creature slither away unharmed. In the scheme of things, this is a small detail, but given that serpents are super common in depictions of Cernunnos and are sometimes even shown coiled around the god's waist, it's a detail worthy of our consideration. Finally, let us turn our attention to perhaps the strongest contender for an Irish Cernunnos equivalent, the Dagda, the so-called father of the Irish gods. As the wielder of a massive club or staff, the Lorgmor, and possessor of a cauldron, the Corra, from which it is said no company ever departs unsatisfied, the Dagda has traditionally been linked to the Gaulish Succulus, a god who is regularly depicted with a long-handled mallet in one hand and in Alla, a jar or barrel for cooking and storing food, in the other. But in the saga text, the Ca Moitura, the Second Battle of Moitura, which is part of the earliest cycle of Irish mythology, the mythological cycle, a curious thing happens. When the daughter of the Fomorian king Indech asks the Dagda for his name, he replies with a string of names, the very first of which is Fionn Ben, the horned man. I mean, case closed, right? Here we have actual textual evidence of an Irish god with horns. Only, it's not that simple. Because while fear means man in Old Irish and ben can mean the horn of an animal, the latter can also mean peak or pinnacle. And when we consider the context of the scene, it becomes clear that the Dagda, regardless of whether he's referring to himself as the horned man or the peaked man or the man of pinnacles, is not being literal. He's being facetious. Horned, in this case, means horny. Or rather, the Dagda is using the term as a euphemism for a state of male arousal. To quote from the text, just a few lines before he gives the first of his many names, quote, "As he went along, he saw a girl in front of him, a good-looking young woman with an excellent figure, her hair in beautiful tresses. The Dagda desired her, but he was impotent on account of his belly." End quote. And now listen to what the young woman replies after the Dagda gives the name Fionn Ben. Quote, "That name is too much!" Exclamation mark. End quote. Joke made, joke understood. Well played, the Dagda. Our conclusion thus must be that the Dagda is not a horned god in the sense that Cernunnos is a horned god. As for other potential similarities between the two Celtic deities, some have suggested that both the Dagda and Cernunnos are representations of what folklorist and anthropologist James George Fraser refers to as the Divine King, a being who embodies the essences of both winter and summer, death and life. It's essentially the Holly King and the Oak King merged into one entity. I explore this concept in more detail in my video, The Case for a Celtic Santa Claus, where I also happen to explain how the Dagda got his aforementioned big belly that prevents him from performing. But once again, I must provide the huge caveat that the Oak King/Holly King interpretations of the Dagda and Cernunnos are modern. They have been applied retroactively and are not attested to directly in any actual texts or engravings. The bottom line, Irish mythology does not have its own version of Cernunnos. Irish hagiography, however, is another matter, as some scholars believe stories about Saint Ciarán, a saint known for communing with wild animals, were based at least in part on Cernunnos. And what, or should I say who, do we find carved into the North Cross at Clonmacnoise, the Irish monastery founded by Saint Ciarán? Well, I'll let you be the judge. If you enjoyed this video, please like and comment and basically just tap all of the little buttons, and by the end of it, make sure you are subscribed to the Irish Myths channel. That really helps. And if you want to learn more about gods and heroes and monsters from Irish mythology, you've come to the right place. I've got playlists on all of those topics, which you can find linked below. As always, my name is I.E. Kneverday, editor of the short story collection Neon Druid and creator of IrishMyths.com. Thanks for coming out.